Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Andrew Schwartz at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. I'm joined by a friend and former colleague at CSIS, Rick Rossow, the Senior Advisor and Chair on India and Emerging Asian Economics at CSIS. Rick, great to have you. I'm sorry we're doing this only by audio because you're wearing an extremely natty tartan waistcoat right now, so good on you.
Yeah, it's a little bit closer to work hours here in DC than it is for you, so I ran right over to jump on this, but really happy that you're having me on. I'm a huge fan. Great to be a part of it for the first time.
Excellent. I'm just wearing my Asia Chessboard hoodie, but let's get right into it. So we always start with the how did you get here story. I think it's interesting to understand where America's, or in many cases, Europe or Japan or Canada's or Australia's top experts on Asia came from. And I know you came from a department store in Michigan. Not that you were assembled there for this purpose, but there cannot have been a straight line from working in your dad's hardware store in Michigan to being one of Washington's preeminent experts on India and the subcontinent. So what happened?
Yeah, growing up in a small town and kind of seeing all these world affairs happening, the breakup of the Soviet Union just as I was going to college, it seemed like a wild, weird place that nobody I grew up with had much interest in or could kind of understand. But for me, it was kind of fascinating. So I get to college and I thought international business and trade would be something fascinating. Russia, because the breakup of the Soviet Union, we all thought was going to be, the next big opportunity. And also Russian happened to be the hardest language they taught at the college I went to, Grand Valley State University. So I kind of fell into that track. After graduation, there's not really a lot of need for Russia experts in West Michigan. So I moved to Washington, D.C. Well, in 1998, there wasn't a lot of need for Russia hands in Washington either. Russia was near chaos and collapse. Boris Yeltsin was friendly and drunk. So, these no good Michiganders with a little bit of Russian language and literature weren't a lot of use. But, Mike, it was $1,000 and a really good interview that kind of got me on the India track. I applied to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce after I couldn't find anything Russia related, just to be a general admin associate with their international division. And because I was president of the student body and I managed a budget when I was in college, they like those life skills more than they care about the grades. So they said, Rick, you can have this job at the chamber, but we have another job that nobody applied for. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce hosts this little group called the U.S. India Business Council, which back in 1998 was the only four Americans whose full-time job was to work on the U.S. India relationship. Well, India just has the nuclear weapons. You had a government that was talking about kicking out foreign companies. So nobody wanted to work with India or touch it with a 20-foot pole. And they said, Rick, if you take this India job instead of the one you applied for, we'll pay you $1,000 more. And I'm like, I'll happily take that. That's a good deal. And I like to joke, but it's probably pretty true. The only thing I knew about India, I knew that Bangladesh was a city in India somewhere, which for your listeners, it turns out it's a different country. So I've learned a few things since then.
You don't tell me you said that in your interview.
I said something worse. My boss, as I was going through the interview, he told me about his great career playing in the lineman at the Harvard University football team. And I said, I didn't know Harvard had a football team. So I survived that. So yeah.
You probably assumed you went to Princeton.
Yeah, right.
When you said that. One of the things that makes your work on India and U.S. India relations so different and interesting is that you think about that, the macro picture, but the micro, what is life like in a hardware store in Western Michigan or a farm in Gujarat? Like you connect things, and I'm sure we'll hear some of those insights from you. But let me start macro to begin with. So you said 1998, you go in, you say Bangladesh is a city in India, you insult your future boss and all that. Bill Clinton tried an opening with India, but the nuclear test made it impossible. Reagan in the early 80s, I have this in one of my books, had put out not publicly, but an internal document, national security directive, saying that the rise of India is in U.S. interests, regardless of their alignment, because they will be on balance, a balancer that helps us. And then in the Bush administration, that was our operating strategy. The president, people like Ashley Tellis and others. And the bet was that India would be, over time, even if not aligned with the U.S. on everything, a net provider of goodness in the international system. Economic growth, stabilization of the Indian Ocean, a balancer to China. Macro, big picture, was that the right bet 20, 25 years ago?
Yeah, and I will give Clinton a little bit more credit than people sometimes do, because you think of that moment India says nuclear weapons in 1998. I was just starting my India career at that point, and the vast majority of DC felt we should sanction India into oblivion. And certainly there were sanctions that came in mandatorily because of the nuclear tests. But for Clinton to take that moment and realize, even if he didn't have maybe as grand of a strategic picture as others in the Bush administration did, but to realize, this is the pivotal moment. Some of the big bets on China weren't paying off even in the early phase, and let's use this as an opportunity to take a crisis to an opportunity. And I happened to be there with President Clinton when he went to India in the year 2000, this 5-day jamboree. And India cares a lot when you show you love the people and culture. And for him to travel around the country, to go to the South, when it was always showing some green shoots about the South of India being really in some ways a more natural partner for some of that early work on IT services. So the Clinton years, I'd say there was a couple of high points, but, he did show up in India and talk about denuclearizing, which didn't always go over so well. So it was good, but there's some other areas where I don't think we had quite as much nuance and tact, I think, in how we engaged, but some good moments there. But with President George W. Bush, we saw not just that the president cared, but the fact that everybody that had direct reporting to the president, felt they needed to tee up some big things and big ideas with India. You just kind of felt that all of a sudden, where Clinton, it was personally the president. Suddenly, with the Bush administration, everybody wanted to get a piece of the pie and find out, big, exciting things that they could do. You asked the critical question, though, is the big bet paying off? And I think the big bet still, is more of a future thing. Now, they've passed China to become the most populous country. They're probably 2 years away from becoming the third largest economy in the world. So the numbers show that it certainly is a great place for business to spend time. It's only growing as a market, even with some headaches. On the security front, that's where we've got to figure out, as they say, walking across the river by feeling the pebbles with your toes. India, they want certain things. They want access to defense technology. They want the United States to support their interests, but not to contravene in their interests, especially in how we engage the neighborhood. But the last 4 years, you did see a pretty remarkable sea change. Up until that point, we'd started to get some weapon sales. We'd been India's largest defense exercise partner for quite some time, signing agreements that allow the export of advanced technology. But operationally, we took some important steps. And I'll list off 3 of them in the last 4 years that I think show a real sea change and really, showing India's indication on stepping up to be a regional power. First and foremost, they authorized 3 shipyards to start doing repair work on American Navy ships. So when you think about wartime scenarios, being able to get to a friendly port that have experience working on ships, that's a big step. Number 2, they signed on as a full member of the regional command that the United States operates out of Bahrain, doing illicit shipping, counter-piracy. So for the first time, you actually have real engagements, real interoperability of our navies in the field, apart from kind of one-offs on humanitarian assistance when a crisis runs. And then third, India's most important strategic asset is the Andaman Nicobar Islands, the island chain sitting right outside the Straits of Malacca, where a significant portion of China trade comes through. And for the first time, they're allowing U.S. military. We had some Coast Guard exercises there. So, we continue to make progress. And in a couple of ways, particularly the shipyards and Combined Maritime Force Bahrain, you see India really kind of deepening interoperability. It's not just sales and exercises, but real world practical applications now. It's still a small ball compared to core allies, but, pretty significant from what we saw 30 years ago.
And the first diplomatic move by Marco Rubio as Secretary of State was that Quad meeting. What was it, the day after the inauguration or something? People are still hungover. And what really stood out for me, and I think it surprised the Australian foreign minister, who's been reticent about security in the Quad, was how much that foreign ministers meeting emphasized maritime security and even defense cooperation. Do you think the Quad's also going to be a formula where we're seeing more of the kind of concrete defense cooperation you just described?
The Quad, of course, the biggest, I think, example is something that's not Quad, although it's all the same 4 countries, which is the massive Malabar naval exercise. They still say it's not a Quad, but it happens to be the same 4 countries. So I'm not a math major, but I believe 1 and 1 pretty much equals 2 most of the time. They did kick off humanitarian assistance disaster relief work stream under the Quad. And we know first responders for major crises tend to be the navies. So, I think we can put some lipstick on it, but we know exactly what we're dealing with that. And there's been informal conversations among the 4 countries. I would say, in terms of the Quad's ability to evolve into more of a security partnership, India is reticent. There's other times when I'd say any of the other 3 partners also, are blowing hot and cold, depending on how they're looking at China. But it is the China threat that's going to be the pacing issue that pushes the Quad into whatever it becomes. If China continues to press out multiple angles, everybody feels their strategic interests are impinged, which we certainly do today. Then I think, for the Quad to step up and play more of a security role, military interoperability, I think it's perfectly on the table. But if China decides to back away, start trying to repair relations with a number of the nations, including Quad countries, maybe they don't move that fast. So I think China is not surprisingly, is the factor that's going to drive how quick or how slow the Quad moves into security. Until then, they're going to look for ways to deliver public goods across the Indo-Pacific, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. So they'll look for nominal ways, but China will push it further, I think, as time goes on.
Yeah, we can, I think, count on the PLA to keep being that independent variable, that pace setter. What about the public goods piece? As you know, I was in the White House running the Asia office when the big tsunami happened in December 2024, stood up the first Quad task force. The speed with which we did it was an indication of the real possibility for aligning these four maritime democracies. But it was public goods. It was basically about rescuing people. And public goods has been the face of the Quad since. Is that what the Trump administration wants to do with the Quad? You think that's going to still be the face?
Not likely. I mean, maybe you'll still have working groups that, kind of point in that direction. But, at the end of the day, you're right. It is about voters in parts of America that were deindustrialized. And that's the only group that seems to have, access and sway. And so I do think they're supposed to have, they haven't announced it yet, but they're looking at having Quad ministers meeting in Washington at the end of the month or the beginning of July. And that second round, hopefully, will have a little bit more visibility on what the work streams are going to look like. Yeah, certainly the United States wants to see everybody that we have engagements with talking about investments they're making, about opening markets to American products. But a lot of countries across the Indo-Pacific still do want to see the United States playing a role in delivering public goods. And I think something like humanitarian disaster relief is going to be there. Another one of the big, I'd say, partial victories the Quad had was this massive ramp up of COVID vaccines. They got in the market a little bit later than would have been a preferable time. But at least that gets the muscles kind of working in the right direction in case it may not be a humanitarian disaster, but the next pandemic. And I think if moments like that happen as well, you're going to see the United States trying to step up. We saw it a little bit the last time that Trump was in office. So smaller on the agenda, still on the agenda, but I expect it's going to evolve more for what are the other countries going to do for me, at least in the interim. But, look, I mean, everybody's going to have a say. Trump can drive the agenda and certainly will be the loudest member of the Quad, but the other countries are going to have a say in this. And if Quad's going to exist, India's got to have its issues on the table. And for India, delivering a public goods and competing for, as they call, leadership of the global South is going to be important. So I think the other partners will make sure that those elements remain.
I think it's going to be harder to do the public goods bit because of the stripping out of USAID. I mean, it was hard enough when the U.S. was putting stuff on the table to get India to step up on vaccines or to get Japan to repurpose things or Australia. It's going to be harder if the U.S. doesn't actually put something on the table. So my guess would be the security bit becomes more and more prominent, primarily because of China, but also just because of the nature of the Trump administration's priorities.
Well, I was just over at State today, and I reminded them that usually the work streams that have resulted in the most concrete outcomes, which would be the vaccines or the fellowship program where they're actually putting Quad students together for doing high-end research, a lot of times it's external capital that comes in and actually makes those things move. So if the Quad wants to stop being such a talk shop and have more of these work streams resulting in concrete deliverables, it's not going to be about the government ponying up a couple of bucks here and there. It's finding external partners that have alignment and will move fast money. It could be the private sector, it could be philanthropies, groups like that. If they can find that kind of complementarity, I think more of the Quad work streams can have quantifiable outcomes because you and I know nothing moves without money. And you can have all the great talk shops you want and all the great initiatives and all the great policy ideas, but somebody's got to put some money to get people on planes, to get vaccines created or whatever it is. And sometimes that might be outside partners, but you got to find, again, those areas of complementarity. Like there've been a lot of groups that wanted to engage the Quad, for instance, on climate, but that's not going to be a core topic for the Trump administration. It sounds like there's some rumbling about, can they keep it on the agenda at all? But again, a lot of areas like that, you might find philanthropies and others that are willing to step in. So external capital might be a good place to go to try to get some real meat on the bones.
Good point. India's relationship with the other Quad members, Japan, has been very consistent since 2006 or so. Regardless of who's in charge in Tokyo or Delhi, sort of just steadily going upward. Australia has been hot and cold, but I think in the right direction. But I think it's fair to say for India, the most important relationship within the Quad is the U.S. And just measuring the trade and military exercise in diaspora and all the other indicators, it dwarfs the other ones, of course. How's the tone in the relationship? You got this, I don't know, would you call it a bromance between Trump and Modi? And Modi goes to Texas and does the Howdy Modi event. And here in Australia, he went to Parramatta, west of Sydney, and did a G'day Modi event. The diaspora really is glue for India's relationships with the US and Australia, probably the UK and Canada, maybe. On the other hand, tariffs, like very, very bad. for the Indian political system, which is, as you pointed out, and I learned repeatedly, very, very proud. So it's kind of the best of times and the worst of times, it seems like, in bilateral relations. How would you describe the U.S. India, the tone and direction of U.S. India relations now?
Yeah, generally India can take umbrage pretty easily when they feel slighted. Trump slights all the time, but because the United States is so meaningful, you look at the three main lanes, right? Security, commercial, and people to people. And the United States is the indispensable partner on all three fronts. On military, we've talked about the largest exercise partner and increasing source of military equipment. On commercial, India exports twice as much goods to the United States as they do to any other country. And also, about 65% of their IT services exports come here with the largest source of foreign investment. So they need the channel to remain open for commercial reasons and people to people. That was the largest source of students coming to the United States, the largest source of tech workers, and all those remittances that go back. So, all three fronts. So even though Trump certainly strikes out and lashes out against India once in a while, the tariff king, things like that, they can take a punch or two because the prize for them of maintaining and maybe growing the relationship, even with these headwinds, is so immense that, for India to decide to switch it off for 3 or 4 years, would be pretty detrimental to the Indian economy. To the United States, India is a growing economic partner, but not nearly as heavy as the United States is from the India lens. But at the same time, as you see Trump once in a while throwing these arrows at India, and a pretty big one recently, and I know we'll talk about the India-Pakistan flare-up where Trump claimed total credit on brokering the peace, which India doesn't necessarily agree with that view on things. But you do see these big summits. I mean, India's been engaged more heavily than probably any other country. You've had a leader summit, you've had ministerial visits, vice presidents had a couple engagements, including a trip to India. And so, India has been prioritized. And I think India has some ability to look through the tweets and see the concreteness. Yeah, India got hit just like the world did by the Liberation Day tariffs, but also India is probably the furthest along with getting a trade agreement done. They had the UK announcement the other day, but that was still more of the shell than a final agreement. The U.S. Trade Representative team is in India this week again, trying to conclude the first phase of probably it'll be a 3-phase trade agreement. So, India, by willing to take a punch or two, might be able to pull some real apples out of a pile of thorns here by becoming the first country across the finish line. And maybe other countries think about India as a place to start putting global manufacturing investment because it has preferential access to the United States. So India's pushing through some headwinds when they do show up and realizing it is being prioritized right now, at least on the first two fronts, maybe not as much on people to people. But, there's only so much they can take. So you never know if ultimately the apple cart will get tipped over, which has happened a few times in recent years.
Can you explain to me how India is possibly the first country to get a trade agreement with the Trump administration? This is the same India that was a nightmare for the U.S. and the WTO, where trade negotiations and liberalization went nowhere historic. What happened? Or maybe it's just a different kind of trade agreement.
Domestic liberalization has been happening pretty consistently, never as fast as most American businesses would like. But, on trade and investment, they've become a whole lot more open than they were 25, 30 years ago. But in terms of doing it through deals, actually, a lot of us would always kind of wonder, like, they're making all these pronouncements opening up on trade and investment unilaterally. Keep that in a bottle and bring it to the table for trade negotiations. You can actually get something from somebody else for doing that. But India chose, for the most part, to do it unilaterally. So this question comes up a lot. Can the United States expect India will come to the table to sign a robust trade agreement? And, frankly, my response to that, India today is more trade friendly than the United States has been. And that's always a bit of a shock for my American friends who have their talking points from 20 years ago. We gave up on trade integration multiple administrations ago. Obama had in his second term, the last real gasp where the United States wanted to cobble together big deals. But of course, it was too little too late, couldn't get any of them across the finish line. Then you had Trump, Biden, Trump, and nobody's showing a real inclination on big trade agreements anymore. India, meanwhile, had signed some significant trade agreements. I mean, they're mostly focused on customs duties, but with Australia, with UAE, with the Swiss-led EFTA group, with the UK more recently. And these are among India's largest trading partners. Sometimes people say, oh, they're tiny countries. Population-wise, that may be, but they're some of India's largest trading partners. So India actually has been more deal-friendly than the United States has been. So the fact that India was willing to come to the table with a deal that at least focuses on customs duties, which is what Trump wants, wasn't terribly surprising. The bigger question is, why is Trump prioritizing India? And I think, to some extent, it's the security partnership. It's the promise of access to this big market. And ultimately, a deal is really going to be one-sided. It's going to be India reducing barriers. And if that helps American companies get exports, it's going to be good for jobs across the United States. So when you think about all these pieces, it's not terribly surprising that India is at least among the first. But if they are the first to get one across the finish line, even I'll, breathe a bit of sigh of relief and wipe a little sweat from the brow, not thinking that it would move as fast as it has been so far. Still isn't signed, lot can happen, but looks like we're getting pretty close.
So when you started at CSIS, you really got people's attention because you sort of said, stop paying attention to the Republic, stop paying attention to New Delhi, pay attention to the states. That's where the big economic decisions are made. That's where the opportunities are. What has happened since then that now liberalization is happening at the national level? Are they catching up to the fastest states, or, what's the internal dynamic of that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I mean, all my years working in India, the one thing you learn, ultimately, if you're thinking about, if you're living in India, who is it that brings electric power, water, sanitation, healthcare? It's almost entirely state government. So there's a lot of attention on what Prime Minister Modi had for breakfast. But if you're trying to get the business environment better, we talk about trade agreements, and look at America's largest trading partners. Most of them we don't have trade agreements with. It's a nice to have, but it's not the biggest driver. The biggest driver is how competitive industries are. Companies make individual decisions. And having been through hundreds of corporate planning meetings over the years, trade agreements and that kind of stuff is usually slide 50. It's never slide 1. Slide 1 is there a market? What's the tax rate? Stuff like that. And that's where India has to make progress to be a much, much larger, a more significant trade partner with the United States. And you're right. A lot of that is things that state governments have to do. Today, you still can't plug into the grid in most parts of India and get reliable electric power. And electricity rates are really high because they double charge companies to be able to provide free electricity for the poor. And, these are kind of things that are so politically jammed up right now. The number of American do-gooders that, sit down across the table and say, hey, India, you need to charge farmers for electric power and things like that. Well, it's not going to stick. A lot of the good advice we have simply is not politically saleable in India. So it's been pretty difficult. Modi, as a former state leader, when he became prime minister 11 years ago, tried to start stoking competition among states. He called it cooperative competitive federalism. They began ranking states on their business environment. They began drafting model regulations for industrial improvement that states could consider adopting. But a lot of that's kind of fallen by the wayside. I think, even some of the states that his party runs ended up being low in these rankings. The rankings were self-reporting by states. And so everybody always looked at they're kind of gaming the system. It wasn't really related to practical experience. So some of the work on the national government trying to stoke states to do better hasn't really paid off. But there are states that just simply want to win business. They look at this as a unique moment in time. Companies are thinking about China plus one or abandoning China. And, while I'd say Vietnam, Mexico, Malaysia, some countries like that probably were the next wave, none of those countries presents anywhere near the size of the consumer market as India. So, a couple of states, Modi's home state of Gujarat, the state of Tamil Nadu in the southeast, these states have really been trying to roll out the red carpet. You wish India's 28 states with 1.4 billion people were all pulling at the oars simultaneously, and then India could become that next big thing. Right now, it's a couple of states. So you've got like a state the size of Vietnam and a state the size of Malaysia that are pulling at the oars. Not all of India quite yet. That I think, hopefully it'll happen in the future. You got elections all the time, new leaders coming in. Sometimes you see improvement, sometimes a little bit backsliding. But yeah, states are going to be crucial. Hopefully more than just 2 or 3 will start pulling at the oars on that.
When you took a job, nobody wanted working on India in 98. And when I started working on India seriously a few years after that in the Bush NSC, there were so many India skeptics. And I found especially the India experts themselves. I did a roundtable when I took over the whole Asia account because I was an East Asia guy. And all of these old India hands were saying, it'll never work. India will never change. There was so much deep cynicism and skepticism, which has mostly been proven wrong. However, India has definite vulnerabilities and weaknesses. And maybe we should go over those and get your assessment. The one that was, of course, on the front page of all the newspapers and the news was Pakistan and the vulnerabilities within the subcontinent. India's far outpacing Pakistan economically and in global influence, but as a security problem, it's still there. And I think most experts look at that exchange and assess that both sides thought they won.
Yeah.
Like neither came away from it thinking that was a mistake. Let's never do that again. They both think they came out better. Pakistan for its international recognition, India for the punishment they caused militarily. So that's almost like the threshold for violence next time has gone up. So for India's global position, for India's economic prospects, for India as a balancer to China, this is a big Achilles heel. What's your take?
Yeah, it is. That's exactly the right characterization. China is today the unquestioned threat that India needs to rally itself around. And Pakistan remains the Achilles heel that you ignore most days. But one small slice, and suddenly you're pulled back into a fray that you don't want to pay attention to anymore. India is so far beyond that in so many ways. But when you have a terror attack, this has been since 2016, 2019, and more recently, India is escalating the counterattacks because the global community is not rallying against Pakistan to the extent India would like to see. And they've been taking the fight. And frankly, the United States has not been putting a lot of pressure on India not to at least have an initial strike back. We would do the same thing. And giving India that ability and freedom without a lot of U.S. pressure to strike back when they have a significant terror attack. It's one of the things I think the United States is doing to try to cement the relationship by giving India a little bit of bandwidth there. Not everybody's going to agree with doing that, but India's going to, strike back when they have terror attacks, whether, we like it or not. If we want to build a relationship, these are moments that, you really can build trust, and you're maybe putting a few nickels in the bank that you can cash in later on. We've had a few of those moments recently, not just, giving India a little bit of space to go back after Pakistan after terror attacks, but, this allegations of murder for hire, our very different positions on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the fact that we didn't sacrifice the relationship during these difficult moments, that helps to build trust, which hopefully, again, we can cash in for something more meaningful later on, because not everybody agrees with, the positions that we took during those times. But they do have a number of vulnerabilities. Pakistan remains, a primary terror threat. Occasionally, India is targeted by ISIS, although in India, it's been kind of a depleted threat. Internally, you've got terrorism, which a lot of it is fueled by external sources. You've also got issues where, huge income incongruities between the wealthy and the poor, and these masses huddled into urban areas. And the question is, how long can you stay in these little hot pots in big cities in India, before people start really getting unhappy about the lack of delivery of public services? Heat waves themselves, something that could destabilize. So, you can think of a few off ramps that can happen because of domestic vulnerabilities. External, Pakistan is probably the most significant, but in terms of something that could also destabilize the U.S. India relationship, another one that I pay close attention to is our differing approaches to the neighborhood. We believe in democracy most days, and not every country in South Asia necessarily adheres to that. Bangladesh probably the most poignant case in recent times. Countries like Maldives, they blow hot and cold between India and China. The United States has differing approaches. You've got a rampant civil war happening in Myanmar. India, for a long time, wanted to continue engaging, but feel they didn't have the muscle to be able to do so, whereas the United States largely abandoned. But India does not want to see the United States having an independent foreign policy with India's neighbors. They want whatever we do there to be backing India's interests to some extent. And that's not the way the United States generally works. So when we talk about vulnerabilities too, that's another big one to keep in mind. India is in the middle of a very unstable neighborhood, and the United States and India have very differing approaches. And that has caused a lot of consternation in the past, and I'm sure it will in the future. So yeah, domestic and international, there's a number of things we need to keep an eye on.
On the neighborhood, I think that, tell me if I'm wrong, that there's a recognition on the Indian side that they cannot handle it alone, that they need the U.S., Japan, UK. 20 years ago, when China started trying to influence the civil war in Nepal, the Indian National Security Advisor and Condi Rice, the U.S. National Security Advisor, and the UK National Security Advisor coordinated regularly. And that was pretty unprecedented for India to invite the Brits and the Americans in to help them handle a problem in an area that should have been their area of influence. Sri Lanka, same thing. Maldives. So I guess it's two-edged. On the one hand, the U.S. is never just going to give a complete pass to India on relations with Bangladesh or Myanmar on democracy and human rights, even under the Trump administration. On the other hand, India can't handle it alone, so they need us. So maybe we just got to work it out.
I think there is a moment when I think U.S. policy is going to change pretty dramatically too. I mean, if we think competition with China is as grave as a lot of us think that it is today and is going to be in the future, severing relationships because they don't have elections like ours and things like that may be less of a priority to the United States. India believes in democracy for itself, but has never tried to promote a certain type of government for others. Of course, we all want to see whatever happens, whether it's election or other means, you've got a friendly leader in the other countries there. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if we end up in a place a little bit closer to India's position on this too, which is not trying to push on democracy and elections. If we think that there's these swing states that may not be perfect democracies, but are going to be important when we think about pulling coalitions together to push back against China's further encroachment. So we may find ourselves a little bit closer to India in that space. Maybe not. I know there's a vibrant debate about that, but depends on how serious, again, things get with China.
Yeah, I'd say precisely because it is serious with China, it's going to be complicated. It's not going to be binary in my view. It's not going to be like engage or don't engage. It's going to be, I agree with you that the US is going to move closer to India in terms of keeping relations with countries, even if they're disagreeable to us because of this geopolitical game with China. On the other hand, we now know enough about China's version of expansionism to know that they prey on weakly governed, corrupt states without internal checks and balances and a free press and civil society. So, yeah, I'd say it's not binary. There's somewhere in the middle. There's a Venn diagram overlap where maybe the U.S. and India start to actually work together on these issues. Right now, we don't.
There's two great examples in India's own neighborhood where free democratic elections are hugely important in the competition with China, Maldives and Sri Lanka. Maldives right now has more of a pro-China government, but 8 years ago, Maldives, we all thought Maldives had kind of broken the wheels of democracy. You had a pro-China government that was going to be in office in perpetuity. China was approaching. They acquired 2 islands for vacation purposes and, some threat that they were looking to do the same thing for military purposes. And with Sri Lanka as well, with port development, that's all well and good. But, if you have an unfriendly government, it doesn't matter if you've got, technical ownership of the port. You can't be landing warships if you have an unfriendly government in a port. So it doesn't matter what equity percentage you have. So the fact that, we thought the Rajapaksas in Sri Lanka were in office in perpetuity, that Maldives, the earlier pro-China government, had broken the wheels of democracy. India leaned in heavily to try to make sure that free voices came out and that they had elections that saw turnover. And for China, that means are you going to expend a ton of money on strategic infrastructure when you don't know every 4 years if you're going to have a pro or anti-government in place? I think to your point, India's actually seeing the benefits of democracy and turnover. China won't expend that kind of money in these places if they're not sure they're going to have a friendly government at any one particular time. You can't base a carrier group on resupply in a port if you don't know if you're going to have a friendly government at that port at different points in time.
Which, by the way, is a game China's trying to play against us in places like Okinawa, Palau, the Philippines. But I think you make a really important point. We don't need India to use our playbook. We don't have to use India's playbook, but we do care about how states are governed and whether or not the people have a voice in countries where China is trying to co-opt them and get strategic bases. Hey, on Pakistan, you said earlier the U.S. has given India a bit of a pass, but wasn't there a pretty strong backlash against President Trump's? First of all, he hyphenated India and Pakistan. U.S. presidents have been disciplined enough to not do for 25 years. And second, that Pakistanis claimed a victory because they claimed that, the U.S. brokering showed Pakistan always wants to internationalize Kashmir. So, but you're describing a little more, benign or view of what the U.S. was up to. Do you think the Indian resentment about the Trump, it wasn't a tweet, what was it? Was it Truth Social?
Yeah, it was Truth Social, where he announced he'd brokered the peace agreement. Yeah, both are true, right? It's two separate. We gave India some space to strike back. But at the same time, once things began to escalate and we began applying pressure, or at least trying to engage both, and then to take that much level of credit for what actually transpired, ultimately, we all kind of understood because Pakistan struck first, at least indirectly through terror proxies. India would have to have the last punch. And so, as much attention was paid, it was really about making sure that Islamabad would agree in whatever form that India could walk away and say that they had the last laugh. And, I'm sure, I know for a fact that officials in the Trump administration kind of late in the game but started to make calls and trying to move the needle on this. But you had others, the Saudi deputy foreign minister was in Islamabad the weekend that the peace, finally kind of broke out there. So we take credit because we have the loudest voice sometimes, but a lot of other forces that wanted to see India not to be pulled back and wanted to see Pakistan restrain itself. So I'm sure that a few years on, when the classified files are released, we're going to find that a lot of groups actually were putting pressure in the right places. The story that came out publicly, is only one small portion of it. And that's, really what bothered India. Certainly the hyphen, talking about the two with a level of parity. And, that's again, it's something that India jumps after every single time. They're worried that Washington is going to fall back into this balancing position, which is just ridiculous. When you think about how far down the road we are with India on advanced military sales and trying to get nuclear cooperation, the level of trade and investment. So when India sometimes fights out and says, look, you're treating us as equals again, the fact they're arguing probably makes a bigger point about that than what I think Washington generally thinks. The distance between two is miles until India makes a big deal out of it sometimes. So I wish the tweet hadn't happened. Certainly, India took umbrage at that. But the reaction probably drove it home a bit more in DC than the actual original tweet by the president.
We may not have to wait 25 years for declassification of the documents. We may read about it in Signal, in a week or two. I mention that because, as Vice President Vance and was other people jumping into the fray in the India-Pakistan dispute, the same people who were disparaging the Europeans on Signal, so there's clearly a different temperature or a different tolerance or whatever for American internationalism when it comes to Asia, I think, compared to Europe. So that was, I guess, small encouragement out of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Last thing, what are you working on? What's exciting you about India-U.S. relations right now?
Well, the biggest thing is, as we talked about before, this chance of getting a trade agreement going. And is that going to be able to really kind of zoom things into the horizon? But, a lot of it is, as I think we kind of hinted at early on this conversation, there's a lot of excitement about India. And then you look at the reality today on the investment environment, security partnership, it still is, it's certainly more than it was, but still relatively thin compared to some of our big trading partners and some of our big security partners. So the question is, in the future, what are we going to morph into? And, in particular, my program focuses a lot on economic commercial. And the big thing that we're looking at right now is in the next 10 years, the first couple of states in India are going to shift from being primarily rural to primarily urban. And sometimes when we all scratch our heads and wonder, why doesn't India take 2 steps in the right direction on its own development path, irrespective of whether its foreign partners are coaxing, cajoling. And a lot of it is because most Indian voters are poor farmers that hold small plots of land. And that's where, you need to appease that group to get elected. You don't care about the big foreign investors and that kind of stuff. But as India urbanizes and cities start to take off and they become the political heavyweights for elections, that's when I think the development trajectory really starts to move in a positive direction. As a country nationwide, it's still going to be 20, 25 years before that happens. But a few states, particularly in the South, are going to get there sooner rather than later. A lot of stuff in our program is very much on economic commercial, India's energy and climate choices, and urbanization, which I think is going to be the most profound change in India's governance since they got independence back in 1947.
Right before I left the NSC during the Bush administration, I had a meeting with a quite senior Chinese official who was talking about various things, including India. And he said, Beijing assesses that U.S. relations with India will continue to grow closer. And that's just the forces of history, and there's not a lot China can do about it. But he said, it's India, so you will be very frustrated. And sounds about right. But the frustration is well worth it, as you've pointed out today.
And it's in both directions.
Yeah.
I mean, here we are about to, threatening to sanction India to oblivion for its Russia position. And then we change foot, And so, there are times when India's ability to look a little bit further out too on Russia, they have a very different position. I mean, they say, and I agree with this, that Russia's biggest long-term strategic threat is also China. And it may not be the position they're at today, but there's going to come a day when I think Moscow is going to look for help. And we think about the world very differently, different perspectives. Sometimes India is right, sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes Washington changes just as fast as Delhi does. We're not an easy partner to work with either. But somehow, thanks to great work by you and many others across the U.S. government over time, we've managed to continue moving mostly in the right direction. So good on you, good on plenty of others. And hopefully we got other good leaders like you that take those right positions in government across time and commit to it even when it's tough.
For all I know, the same official was in Delhi the next week telling Jai Shankar or somebody that China assesses India will grow closer to the U.S., but it is America, so you will be frustrated. Rick, thanks for keeping us honest. Everybody follow Rick's work at CSIS. It's the most on-the-spot analysis of what's happening in India and how it affects the world you can find. So, Rick, appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike.
For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.